All right, so let's start integrating Mongoose into the assignment that we've been working so far. Okay. All right, so, for instance, we had in our application, we had been working with on the client side. We have on the client side, we have several components that deal with each one of the data types, right? The users, the websites, the widgets, the pages, and for instance, login first allows us to type in an username and password, and then uses a user service to go fetch to see if this user exists. Okay, it uses a client user service that is declared over here. User service find by credentials. This user service sends the request back to the server, right, through an HTTP request. There it is, passing in the username and password, and then waits for the response to come back from the server. On the server side, right, we have a user service on the server that is waiting for the request of those users, right? That checks to see if we have a username, we have a password, and if we have a username and password, what it does is that it tries to find it in the local array of users. Yes? Right now it uses this local array of users up here. What we'd like to be able to do is instead go to a database to do this, right? Fetch username and password from a database as opposed to this array over here. So let's see if we can do that. Okay. All right. All right. So to do that, we had already connected to a database for testing purposes. I think we had put it. Where do we put it? Source, server, and is it here? Apparently not. Where do you see it? Oh, okay. All right. No, yes. So this was the example we were playing around with. Yes. So what we want to use is some of this what we've learned here, and integrate it into our application. Okay. So to do that, inside of app.js, what we're going to do is that we're going to declare here a directory where we can handle everything that has to do inside with the database. Okay. So one of the things that we're going to do here is that we're going to declare one directory, one file that handles the connection to the database. All right, so we'll create a JavaScript here and call it maybe model.js. And model.js is going to be responsible for connecting to the database, just what we did here, okay, in our example. We're going to connect to require Mongoose and connect to the database. Okay. This one over here, this Mongoose test that we were playing around, it was a standalone, right, JavaScript file talking to a database. Yes. What we want to do is integrate this, right, what we've been playing around, right, and integrate it into the rest of the application, right. And we're going to do that inside of this model.js. So we're going to connect to this. Once we we're going to require this from our app.js. App.js is our entry point, right? This is where we orchestrate the rest of the application. We're going to require model.js so that it connects to the database, right? And once it connects to the database, we can then start perhaps communicating with the database. All right. So let's require it right here. We're going to require models models.js. So we're going to require it. It's going to go in here. We're going to have to export this. Maybe we'll store it in a DB, the database, and we're going to export it right here. We're going to say module.exports equals DB, so that when we require it, we can store it right here, DB, and have a reference to it. Okay. Once we're connected, right, we can start creating the various models that we need for each one of the data types. Right. So let's create a directory for each one of these. So we're going to say the user model, and in here we're going to have the schema and the models for just the user. So this will be user.schema.server.js. And here we're going to have the schema that we already did here. We already did some work here. So let's copy that from here. There we go. Let's copy it. There we go. User schema. Okay, there's our user schema. And what we're going to do here is also we're going to export it. We're going to say module that exports user schema. Because we're going to need this user schema in another file, right? We're going to need it in the model, right? So we're going to export it here, so that from our user model, I'm going to create a user model here. This will be user.model.server.js. In here, we're going to have more or less the same code that we had here. There we go. User model. Let's bring it over here. Okay. And we're going to use all these functions as well. We like to be able to create users. We like to create a find user. Let's grab all these and let's put it in here. Okay, there we go. What we don't have here is the user schema. We don't have it, but we know it's in a file that is sibling to us. We can load the user schema from require. Let's say require /user schema. Oh no, it's what is it? User.schema.server. There it is. Okay, and that schema, that user schema.server, right, is declaring the schema. We're just exporting it, and then we're loading it here so that we can now use it to declare our model. Yes? Okay. All right. Okay, so we have a user model. What we could do here is that somebody who wants to use the model, who would want to use this model to be able to create find user by ID? Probably our services, right? The services that are doing the fetching of the users or find users by username and password. This one would like to get a hold of that user model, right? To be able to create users, to find users, right? Notice that right now all these create functions, right? Being able to create users, find users. Currently, they're updating this array. Yes. Instead, we want it finding things and retrieving and updating and creating things in the database, right? So here we would like a hold of that user model, right? We would like to do a require var user model. We would like to load that user model, which is, where is it? It's let's go up one, then down to models, and down to user, and down to user model. There we go. Now we have the model, and we have it now listed bound to this user model object. See that? Okay. And what is that user model object? It's, well, we haven't exported anything. We haven't exported anything just yet. Okay. What do we want to export? Well, we can export this object right here. We can say module.exports equal user model. Yes, we can do that. That would give the access to do what? Do user model create, user model.find, user model.find by ID, right? It would allow us to do those calls from the service. Yes? Right? But accessing directly the service, right? It's a, from the service directly connecting to the database and using the raw communication to the database is considered bad practice. Because what happens is that tomorrow, if we want to change the implementation of the database, if we don't want to use, for instance, Mongoose anymore, and we want to use MySQL, we don't want to use Postgres, or we want to use some other vendor, okay? Everybody who is loading this model would have direct access, or would be a direct dependency with whatever the vendor you're using, yes? Right? And it would have to use the API for that particular vendor, correct? If you change the vendor, the API might change. Make sense? So a better implementation is to abstract the vendor through a well-defined user interface, right? Well, not user interface, an API, right? So what we're going to do is that instead of exporting this like this, right? What we're going to do is that we're going to tie all these functions. Notice that all these functions, they're hiding the fact that underneath we're using Mongoose, right? Notice that anybody who's calling these functions, the only thing that it needs to know is that you're expecting a user object. I have no idea how you're storing this in the database, right? You're just expecting a user object. Make sense? Here, you're just expecting a user ID. I have no idea that you're going out to a database and retrieving any of this, right? So that's a nice little API, right? That shields everybody else upstream from having to deal directly with the database. Make sense? Right? So we're going to tie to the user model. We're going to tie all these functions. Find user by ID. We're going to do find user by ID. Right? So now the user model object is going to have also these new attributes that are going to be bound to the functions. Right? That we're going to be bound to the functions. So you can say user model dot create user. It's going to be bound to the functions. Find all users. Find all users. So now that when we export it back here on the service, we can use this user model, right? We can use this user model, say dot find all users, find user by ID, create user, right? Which is now very convenient. Okay. All right. So let's try and replace some of these. Right? For instance, let's try and replace logging in. Let's replace logging in. So logging in, we need to replace this first if statement right here. Right? That if we have a username and password, we need to replace this. Instead of looking it up in the array, we want to go out to a database. Okay? So let's do that. What we like to be able to do is, instead of having this right here, instead of doing this, what we like to be able to do is go out to our user model and do a find by credentials, okay, and pass the username and password, okay. But notice that we don't have this implemented in our model. So let's go back to our user model. We don't have it. It's not implemented. Okay, so let's implement it. Let's implement it. So user model. So let's implement it right here. So function, find user by credential, and we're going to pass in username and password. So that internally here, we know we're using Mongoose, right? But anybody who's using the data access layer here should not care, right? And this is not only here in Node.js; it's a very common pattern, even if you're using Java or any other framework, right? Typically, you encapsulate all data access, right, in a well-defined set of interfaces that deal with the data access layer. Okay? Usually they're referred to either as data access layer or data access objects, DAOs, right? It's a very common design pattern, right, that encapsulate all data manipulation inside of a set of classes or set of dedicated functions. Right? All right, so here we could do user model, right, and do an actual find And we're looking for a user that has a username that matches the username parameter, and the password matches the password parameter that you pass in. Yes? Okay? Now, up to this point, the only way that we know how to retrieve data from the database is to provide a function right here. Right, to provide a function. Let's do that. Let's see, function. Okay, and let's just print out console log the document or the user. Right, so we know that the first argument is the error, and the second argument, hopefully, it's the user that matches. Yes? Okay. I'm sorry? Yeah, it'll be an array. Yep. Let's see what happens. So let's see. So notice that obviously our login is going to fail for now. Right? For now, it's going to fail. Let's maybe respond JSON. Let's send back an empty object for now. Okay, back to the client. So it's going to be a failed login because nobody didn't find anybody. Okay? But let's do that in a minute. So let's restart. Let's start the npm start. And also let's start our server on the server side. Let's start it. That's listening at 3100. Oops. Maybe you already had one started. Let's stop that. Oh, what's it complaining? Oh, Mongoose. You can't find Mongoose. Where do we use Mongoose? Oh, server schema here. Okay, we need to load Mongoose here, so let's do that. So we're going to do var Mongoose require Mongoose. Okay, let's start again. Let's restart again. Still complaining. Model schema. Model schema is using Mongoose also. Okay, so we'll need to load Mongoose as well here. Mongoose require Mongoose. Okay, let's try again. Where else? Okay, looks like it didn't blow up. Okay, hopefully already it's connected to a database. And TypeScript, I think, is that running? Yes. Okay, so let's try and log in now. So localhost 4200, log in. Okay, so here we go. Let's see and inspect, see what's the communication like with the server, and let's look at the network. All right, so let's try and log in with Alice. So notice that it comes back with an empty object, I believe, because that's what we're coming back from the server, right? But let's look at what the server came back with. On the server side, in the run, notice that it came back with what? It came back with all of them. Wait a minute. Let me clear this for a second. Let's try that again. Okay, must have been an old one. So let's step. Oops, what happened? I didn't mean to do that. Let's step through the code here in the service layer. We're right here. Let's put a breakpoint there, right there. Okay, and let's restart the server, and let's try logging in again. Okay, so we're in the server, right? And we are about to call credentials, and we can look at the console, and we can step in. And so we're about to do a find, and let's put a breakpoint right there. Let's continue. All right, so it came back. Looks like we got an error. We got an exception. Let's see what we have. User. It's an array of 0, and the error. Let's see. Do we get an error? Here. Okay, error null. So over here, what is it complaining over here? It says can't set headers after they are sent. And so that looks like it's over here. Oh, we might have forgotten to do a return. Yeah, we forgot to do a return right here. Right? It was just continuing right? And it's trying to send the response yet again. So let's restart again, and let's step through this again. Let's log in. Again, it's on the server. Let's go in. So we're here. The user came back as 0 because the username. We're out of scope already. Okay, let's return. So the user is null. There's nobody that matches with Alice and Alice. Let's try it again. There we go. So username Alice and password Alice. So we don't have anybody with that matches Alice and Alice. So the user is null, array 0, and we have no errors. Okay. So what we'd like to be able to do first to see if indeed we can find somebody with Alice. Let's go to Mongo. We don't have anybody with username Alice and password Alice. So let's add a password to Alice over here. All right, so let's update that. We can do a db.user.update, and we can say update the person whose username is Alice. Right? We can set the password to be Alice as well. Okay, and we'll do pretty. Let's see. Okay, now we have Alice who has username and password Alice. Yeah. All right, so let's try it again now. Let's hit login. Okay, we have again username Alice and Alice. Okay, and let's continue. And now the log, it says that we have an array of 1. So we have one match. If we continue, in the console, we get an empty array. Wait, what? How could it be an empty array? It didn't say an array of 1? Why are you embarrassing me? Continue. User is an array of 1. We can look at the objects in the array, which is also interesting. If we say 0, this length is 1. Notice that we would have expected here. The actual JSON object that represented the Alice and username and first name and last name, right? What we seem to be getting here is a meta object. An object that is a little more than just Alice. The actual object lives under _doc. See that? If we open it, there's our actual object. Alicia, Wonderland, Alice, and Alice. See that? But the actual object that is in the database is wrapped into this more complex object that is used to keep track of the life cycle of that object. All right? Which is a very common technique even in other frameworks such as JPA or in .NET entity, the entity framework in .NET and Hibernate in Java. It's a very common technique that when you ask for data from a database, right, what you get back is really a wrapped object that keeps track of its life cycle, right? Because what happens is that this is not just any object; it's an object that is somehow, connected to a database, right? To some record in the database, so that we want to keep track of the life cycle. If any of those fields changes, if you change the first name or the last name or the date of birth or salary, right? Now you have a problem of staleness, right? Where you have something that is in RAM that says one thing and something that is in a record that says complete something else, right? So you have a problem of saying, wait a minute, which one is true? Is it what the database says or what's it's in RAM, right? So these frameworks typically give you a mechanism to detect when an object is dirty, right? That has been changed, right? Or that it is pristine, right? That is exactly what the database says, right? And that if anything changes, you can ask the framework to immediately make the two the same, right? Go back and save any changes back to the server, right? So we're not going to do that, but anyway, we do have an object user, and why is the console? Oh, there it is. Well, I don't know why it wasn't printing. Continue. There's our array of objects. That one single Alice that matched my criteria. Yes, right. So we know that username and password are presumably unique, the combination of username and password. So there should be only one of these, right? So instead of find, we could use another syntactic sugar, right? Well, we could just say user sub 0. That would be okay. But something that's a little more elegant is to use not a find, but a find one. When we're certain, right, that the query should return just one object, okay, we can use find one. But what find one does is that it just gets the array and then just unwraps it and gives you just the first one. Yes, that's that. When we know that username and password is not a key, right? A find by ID would be a key, right? Find user name, but it's still also a unique identifier. Anyway, so let's restart the server and let's do a console again. Let's try login, and the server found there's our Alice, that one single object. Yes, but how do we get this object back to who needs it, right? We really need it where? In the service. The server needs it right here. Yes, we would love to be able to do something like this: var user equal user model. Yes, unfortunately, ideally we could do something just like this. So return user. Okay. Unfortunately, it's not as simple. Right? We're going to have the same issue we had when we were communicating between the web service on the client and communicating with the server. Right? We had to use promises. We had to subscribe. Right? And use asynchronous communication. Same thing here. Right? The server for the database is running in one process, and this server in Node.js is running in a completely different process. Yes? Right now, they're both running on my same machine. But when you deploy it in Heroku, we're literally going to have Node.js running on Heroku and the database server running on MLab. So to handle this, what we're going to do is I'm going to use a different syntax. Instead of using this function error user, instead we're going to use the following syntax. Okay? What Mongoose does is that it provides the following syntax: return. Return whatever the find one returns. And it's not the user object. It's not the object that it's retrieving from the database. Instead, it's going to return what is called a promise. A promise that at some point in the near future, I will get back to you with the data. Because I'm still busy talking to the server. All right? And you shouldn't wait for me. So keep going doing whatever you want to do. All right? Leave me a callback so that I can call you back with the data. Right? So on the service, what we're going to do is that instead of this is not going to work. Instead, what this returns is a promise. Var promise. Okay, very much what we did in the client. Actually, no. In the client, we didn't do it this way. We used subscribe. Right. So this promise object, what it allows us to do is to register. So the promise object has a couple of functions, right? That allows us to, for instance, allows us to register a function using the then, saying at some point, call the following function. Call the following function that I'm giving you here, and hopefully you're going to pass me the result of having talked to the database, retrieve the data, give it back to me right here. Okay, so presumably this is the result. And let's do a console log result. Okay, let's try it again. Let's run the database again, and let's log in again. Notice that this result is the actual object that we need, right? Let's put a breakpoint right there. Let's do login again. Okay, there it is, results. If I hover over it, it's the object, the model object that has Alice and Wonderland and username and password embedded in it. See that? Okay, that is the object I need. That is the object I need. So what we could do, now that I have the object here, now that I know that this is the actual user, I can now bring this. I can bring this response JSON in here. I can bring it in here, right, and actually respond with the user. See that? I can respond with the user back to whoever's waiting for this. The client is waiting for this, right? It used to be that this object was retrieved from the array. Instead, now is being retrieved from the database, right? So let's try this again. Let's restart. Okay, so now let's do a login. And it doesn't work. Wait, what? What happened? Ooh, sorry. Let's restart. Let's do a login. Okay, it's coming here, right? We have the results that is going to go back to server, and we're going to do a return. Okay, so the client, notice that the client has moved on as if it was successful. We did get back a user object from the service, from the server. Notice that it didn't quite work, right? Because the profile it has an ID. Notice the ID that we're using here. See that ID? It's no ID that we've created. It's an ID from the server. It's the one that matches. If we go to Mongo, it matches this ID right here. Okay, that's the object that we're getting back on the server, right? And the profile is expecting to find that user in the server. But the way we do that is going back to the service, finding it by ID using this find by ID. See this find by ID? If we put a breakpoint here, the profile is going to try and find it using this find by ID, right? So let's try it again. Let's go back in the login. Let's try login again with Alice. Again, it's going to return this. Let's remove that breakpoint. And now the profile is trying to find that user. It's passing the user ID, right? The user ID is this long string, right, that was generated by Mongo. It's going to try and find it in the array. It's going to fail because it's not in the array, obviously, right? And then that's why over here in the profile there's nothing for us to render. There's nothing for us to render. So the next thing we need to do is to replace this find user by ID to use the database, right? Let's use the database instead of using this mechanism, right? We're going to use instead the service. I mean the user model. User model. I think we did implement find user by ID. There it is, right? We did implement it before, didn't we? Right? And we're going to pass the user ID right here. That's going to return a promise. Okay, we can do a var promise, or right, this find user by ID already returns the promise, and we can use the then right here. Right, we can give it the function. Hopefully, this is the one user that matches that ID. Okay, and we could just send back response and respond with that user right there in that function. Okay, but the find user by ID, we need to do some tweaking because right now it's using this function. See that? We're using the old syntax. So instead, we're just going to do a return the promise. Okay, right. So let's do that. Let's try it again. Let's restart. Okay, let's go back and log in. We'll do a login. Goes and tries and fetches it. Let's do a breakpoint right here to see if it found the user. There it is. Let's hover. Looks like we have a model for the user. And doc, there's Alice. So it found Alice. We can continue, and that's going to go back to the client, and we have Alice, Alicia, and Wonderland. Right, from the database, not from, well, obviously from the server, but the server going out to the database to fetch this information. You see that? Right, so there it is, right? So the client, notice that we didn't do anything in the client, right? The components stayed the same, the templates stayed the same, the user service on the client stayed the same, right? The only thing that we needed to tweak is the user service on the server, okay? And add the user model and the schema and whatnot. Make sense? All right, yes?
We saw retrieving the users from the database.
Yep.
Before we did the find one.
Yep.
Wrapper, right?
Yep.
So was that only? Did we only use the find one, like to properly print out to the console, like you did?
No, they all return these wrapped objects. Okay. only when they're going to be written to the console or sent over as a stream. They're going to be written out to some stream, right? Either the console error or stream back to HTTP. Then it unwraps it and says, okay, you don't really want the meta object. You really want that one object, right? So what it does is that overrides the print to a stream and says, okay, I'll give you the unwrapped object. So it knows how to print itself as a string representation.
So if you like wanted like an array.
Yep. Yeah. So the array would be the unwrapped objects. Yep. So as long as you are within Mongoose, right, you are working with the original objects, with the wrapped objects, right? So it only uses it to see, for instance, if you have setters or getters or anything that changes the attributes. For instance, if I modify the first name or last name, whatnot, it would detect that the attribute has changed, right? So you could, for instance, turn around and immediately say user.save, right? That would send back a request back to the server, the database server, and it would do an update on the server, and it would come back with that update having been updated. Yeah, pretty powerful.